Take 7. Gonna get this done. It's gonna happen. I've had a barking dog outside the window, across the street. But you know when a little dog is tied to a post or in the car, whatever it is, and they're crying for their owner. Yeah, it was like that for about 20 minutes. I've had Shadow ruin one take. I've had Lilybell ruin another one. And then just a couple of misspeaks as well that I'm like, yeah, I got to start over. So at this point, we're up to take number 7. And I think that's a record. I think that's a record for me. 91-92. 75th anniversary, and this is the only jersey I have from that season which has the patch on it. I have a lot of the 75th anniversary jerseys. I don't actually have the Toronto one. I thought I did, but I don't. And it's sad because the Toronto 75th anniversary jersey is really nice. Remember, that was when I said, you know what? The old Maple Leaf looks so much better than the plain one that they wear regularly. But here we are. And the old-fashioned Maple Leaf is kind of what they use now. So 91-92, kind of a big year for Pittsburgh. Back-to-back Stanley Cup championships, the second out of 5 that they've won since 91. And Kevin Stevens is at his best. He is the power forward du jour. He is all over everywhere, and he's worth every cent of whatever Pittsburgh has to pay him. He is, honestly, with Cam Neely being sidelined most of the year, he is the guy when you look at power forwards in the National Hockey League. And he's a big part of that Pens repeating, and he's kind of forgotten a little bit historically because he peaked and then he fell off scoring-wise not long after that. And so, yeah, the Pens repeat, and then, of course, the big storyline of that as well is the Badger Bob Johnson, who was their coach in 91 when they won the Stanley Cup. By the time we reach 92, Badger Bob passes away. And so you need somebody to coach this team, and they go with Scotty Bowman. Scotty Bowman steps in, and he is the perfect person for the job. No one else, I think, could have done as well as Scotty Bowman. When they talk about Bowman and the Stanley Cups that he has, and they say, well, yeah, he's got a lot of cup rings, but look at the teams he coached. Yeah, and look at how some of these teams, when he leaves them, they don't win anymore, and how many teams we can point to in history that have been really talented but don't win in the playoffs. You need a smart coach to get your team there. So for Pittsburgh, it's Bowman, and they are repeat champions in 92. Toronto, it's a miserable year if you look at just the point totals at the end of the year by the team. However, it gets better as the year goes along. And they make the big Dougie Gilmour trade. So Cliff Fletcher calls up Calgary. He also has dealings with Edmonton. And what we end up with is Grant Fuhr being the starting goaltender. We end up with Doug Gilmour coming over in a trade. Jamie McCowan's involved in it as well. And what they give up to Toronto isn't enough. And I argued this with Flame fans at the time, who argued, oh, no, it's fine. Gilmour had to go, and it's all right. We've got all this other depth, and everything will be okay. And I kept saying, you guys are crazy. It's not going to be okay. Well, Gary Leeman's a 50-goal scorer. No, he's not. I know he had 50 goals. He's not going to get it again. We have that argument now, right, where we'll talk about somebody, and there'll always be that guy that pops up and goes, well, he had 40 goals 2 years ago. Yeah, but that's not really who he is. And with Gary Leeman, that 50 goals really wasn't who he was. That was just out of nowhere. So they have 10 wins in the first half of the season and 20 in the second. And even though Toronto not really making waves yet overall, we know they're going to. We know it's on the way. And then they had Pat Burns after the season as coach, which is going to be just exactly what they needed. Burns walks away from Montreal. Walking away from Montreal to go to Toronto would have been unheard of in the Ballard regime back in the 80s. So this is a different team in the 90s, and it's easy to forget just how good Toronto was at points as well because they didn't win the Stanley Cup. So we can just look at the Stanley Cup and go, you know what, they haven't touched it since 1967. Reality is, they've been close. The Philadelphia Flyers, well, see, so they don't have a great season, and they bring back Bobby Clark. He was fired for like a year and went to Minnesota, and I don't like this, and went back to Philly. And they make the huge trade. So Lindros is traded twice. He's traded to the Rangers and to the Flyers. and an arbiter comes in and goes, yeah, the Flyers made the trade first. So, smart move by the Nordiques. If we could trade this Lindros kid twice, brilliant. We can trade him twice, and we can get twice the number of players back. This will be great. We'll get John Van Beesbrook and Ron Hextall. Booyah! We're great. We have Doug Waite, and we have Peter Forsberg, and yeah. So the Flyers end up getting the deal, and they win themselves an Eric Lindros, and it is a huge deal. It is one of the biggest trades in NHL history. Now, on the Boston side of things, Cam Neely only plays 9 games. All right, shut the windows because there's somebody mowing their lawn right across the street, and I'm this close to a Bill O'Reilly moment. Okay, back to Boston. Cam Neely plays 9 games that year. His thigh and his hip are a problem thanks to Ulf Samuelsson. Bruins fans never forgive Ulf Samuelsson. Bruins fan here never forgave him. The Bruins do suffer as a result, which of course you're going to. You lose a 50-goal scorer like that, heart and soul guy, power forward as well. That takes the heart out of the Bruins. Now, during that season, they add Adam Oates to the team from St. Louis in a deal which heavily to me favors the Boston Bruins. Oates not happy with things in St. Louis and wanting a little bit more money. And at the end, they take Craig Janney. There's more involved. But basically, Janney for Oates. I'll take that deal all day long. Oates has 10 goals in 26 games with the Bruins after having 10 in 54 games with St. Louis. What we learn about Adam Oates in Boston is if he doesn't have the wingers to score goals, he'll score them himself. And Adam Oates, we learn in Boston, has a pretty darn good shot. He's actually a pretty good goal scorer in his own right. So while I would still say he's the best passer that I've ever seen, he's also a pretty good goal scorer. So we find that out in Boston. Buffalo. Pat LaFontaine has 93 points in 57 games, which is insane, right? So he would have had about 120, 121, 125. How high do you want to push it? He would have had probably about 125 points over a full season. He was a machine at that point. And there's arguments about just how great Pat LaFontaine really, truly is. Of course, concussions will seep their way into the conversation. But at this point, it's a broken jaw that causes him to miss 13 out of those 23 games he misses. Meanwhile, for Buffalo, they don't make headway because Darren Pupa falls back to earth. So Pupa, who had been all-world in 1990, 2 years later, and we're talking about how he's kind of middle of the pack. And that happens. Goalie has a career year and then has a hard time repeating it. Calgary, this is the first year in 17 that they missed the playoffs, and it's mismanagement. It is 100% it's mismanagement by the Calgary Flames. They're moving guys out that they shouldn't. They're not getting enough back for the guys they shouldn't be trading in the first place. And in general, once they're done moving everybody around, and Doug Riseborough is part of this as well, it just all falls apart. And the Gilmore deal really stands out here, as they didn't get enough back. The Chicago Blackhawks, they win 11 games in a row in the playoffs. They go on this incredible run, just to be stopped in the Stanley Cup final by Pittsburgh, who had won 7 in a row. And because Pittsburgh sweeps them, Pittsburgh won 11 in a row. So those are still records to this day that both Chicago and Pittsburgh won 11 games in a row in the Stanley Cup playoffs in 92. Darryl Sutter is actually named head coach after that season. So Mike Keenan steps down as coach to focus solely on being the general manager. And Darryl Sutter's brought in to be the coach. Tim Cheveldae in Detroit plays 72 games, which is too many. Admittedly, that's too many. And they know that's too many, so Vince Riondo, they're hoping, as backup, will play more games and spell him off a little bit. But Cheveldae is a pretty good goaltender. He wasn't mentioned in the history video for Detroit this morning, but he's a pretty good goaltender at this stage. They had a great first half, fantastic, and then kind of the middle of the road second half, and then out of the playoffs in the second round against Chicago Blackhawks. So it's the best of times, the worst of times for Detroit. And the best of times, the really, truly best of times, are still 5 years down the road. Edmonton, solid second half. And that solid second half and a run to the conference finals, where they get swept by the Chicago Blackhawks, it kind of shields them from the fact that things are kind of falling apart. This is a team that is no longer a champion, or really close to being a champion. And the reality that not wanting to pay these players that won all these Stanley Cups for them, it's starting to really hurt them. Their roster is significantly weakened. And again, when you're trading away players, much like Calgary, when you're trading away these players that have been great for you for a long time, or players that are just stars, make sure you're getting enough back. And in both Edmonton and Calgary's cases, they really weren't. The Whalers. The Whalers win less at home than the Sharks that year. The Sharks are an expansion team. That's an ouch. That's what that is. And for the Whalers, yeah, it's a miserable season. John Cullen, who was acquired as part of the deal for Ron Francis, Olaf Samuelsson, he has a down year, and then he has back surgery after that. Cullen, he was a good player. I liked him. It's too bad that he's tied to the Francis deal because he was a decent enough player, but he was not worthy of being traded for Francis. It's pressure he never really manages to overcome, and he never lives up to that kind of standard as a member of the Whalers. The Kings have some players that were Oilers back in the 80s, but they're not having the success that they felt that they would. So in 92, you're looking at not elite results for this team that's getting older. He's already talked about how old the Kings are now. Jari Kurri, coming back from Italy, only has 23 goals. The debate at the time was, is he not scoring because he had a year in Italy and he's not really in NHL level shape, ready for NHL level competition? Or is he just getting older? He's 31. Is this just one of those things where now that he's in his 30s, we can expect diminished production? Gretzky scores 31 goals, 90 assists, 121 points, which is good, but it's a far cry from the he might score 200 now that he's back with Jari Kurri talk that we had the previous summer. So Gretzky's numbers have started to fall a bit. He's human at this stage in his career, and 31 goals is below what his standard was as recently as 2 years before that. Bob Gainey is in as Minnesota's general manager, which was bizarre. Really bizarre. Bob Gainey, Montreal Canadian, and the feeling was he would have been a Montreal Canadian for life, but he gets a shot at general manager in Minnesota, and he takes it when Bobby Clarke goes back to the Philadelphia Flyers where he belonged. Bobby Clarke in Minnesota didn't work. They had a 3-1 series lead on Detroit. And coming off of the 1991 run to the Stanley Cup Final, they had to feel pretty good about their chances. And then they lost 3 games in a row to go out against the Detroit Red Wings, who would get swept by Chicago in round 2. So it's a sign that Minnesota's got some good things going on, but in general, they still have a lot of work left to do. And again, and I've mentioned this in yesterday's as well, there's rumblings about the team, and is the team going to move? Montreal, Pat Burns is out. I knew I was eventually going to say Brent because I put just Burns on the board, right? So Pat Burns is out. Demers is in after that season. Decent enough year for Montreal, but remember, Montreal, you win the Stanley Cup or you're a failure. That was the standard. Right up until the early 90s, the standard was Stanley Cup or nothing. There was no in between. Pat Burns even said in an interview, if there were 2 Stanley Cups awarded each year, Montreal Canadian fans would expect to win both or declare failure. If you only won 1 Stanley Cup that year, it's a failure. The pressure is extreme, and they go through a lot of coaches and general managers in this stage. The loss of Chelios, though, to Chicago helps Chelios. They're in the finals, and it hurts Montreal. So Denny Savard, who's doing his best, is not the Denny Savard of the mid-'80s. He's not going to score you 130 points anymore. And Chelios, that leadership that he brought to the Montreal Canadiens is gone. And so Chicago is the better team for that trade. And Montreal definitely regretting that trade already. New Jersey. New Jersey wins a franchise record 38 games that year. And if you're going, that doesn't seem like very many. It's not. But when your record includes the Kansas City Scouts and the Colorado Rockies, it's not a history of winning that you've got there. So the 38 wins are good. They show some really, really solid building, and they look pretty good. And so, of course, Lou Lamoriello fires the coach. Tom McVie is out, and Herb Brooks is brought in. Herb Brooks really shouldn't move into the office and get all that comfortable. We'll get into that in the next video. But New Jersey firing the coach, Lou's known for that. This is really where Lou gets to the whole you're gone. And it's weird because even after a Stanley Cup, are you safe? No, not really. But again, we'll get to that as we get through these videos. Sean Burke sat out. Remember, yesterday I mentioned in the other video, he wanted to trade and Lou went no. So Lou lets him sit out for a year. Sean Burke goes over, plays for Team Canada, plays at the Olympics, is a Canadian hero, but in New Jersey, he's persona non grata. And what makes it worse for Burke is that Terrari's the starter and he's pretty darn good. And then Craig Billington steps in as the backup, and he's fine too. He's a capable backup. So for the New Jersey Devils, they don't really miss Sean Burke. And when you're sitting out and you're trying to make a team trade you, it's really important they miss you while you're gone. And in this case, they really didn't miss Sean Burke. He would be traded, but not until August of 92. So he sat out an entire year waiting to be moved. The New York Islanders, they traded LaFontaine to Buffalo, of course. Brent Sutter ends up in, I believe it was Chicago. And yet, even though they're trading away these talented players, and Sutter, of course, was part of the Stanley Cup dynasty they had in New York, they actually get better. The Islanders improve. And they're going to continue to show improvement into 93. And then it'll fall back to earth. But right now, things look pretty good for the New York Islanders, even though in the playoffs, they don't go very far. The New York Rangers, 105 points. They're number one. They're the greatest. And Messier's their leader. And in the playoffs, they're out. So the Rangers, it's tremendous regular season results. And in the playoffs, mediocrity. They did try to go for Eric Lindros. And that deal falls through. And in retrospect, it's probably good for the Rangers that it did. If they had acquired Eric Lindros, do they win the Stanley Cup in 1994? I'm not sure that they do. I'm not saying that adding Lindros as a number 2 center behind Messier wouldn't have been crazy at that point, but what they would have had to give up to get Lindros, and you look at the pieces that were involved, I'm not so sure that that would have made them Stanley Cup champions in 94. It's an interesting topic for another time. The Ottawa Senators join the National Hockey League. They opt for youth and expansion, however. And when they drafted their expansion roster, nobody tried to fluff it up and say, oh, this team could contend. This team could... No. Everybody said, okay, so these are all kids. These are unproven players. Other than Peter Sidorkiewicz, who he drafted to throw him to the Wolves. Sidorkiewicz had been the goaltender for the Whalers, so he knows about losing. And he goes into an Ottawa situation where he really can't win. No, literally can't win. This is a team that's going to lose a lot. And with their number 1 draft pick, they picked Alexei Yashin, who was number 2 overall. And the Senators are well aware that their initial season is going to be bad. And the insane part is that even when they're previewing the following season, all they talk about is, can they hit 22 points? Can they avoid having the worst record in the history of the National Hockey League? Can they avoid falling behind the Washington Capitals record of 21 points? Can they hit 22? And they do, but barely. The Nordiques, of course, get that major haul for 88 for Lindros. And they have a 52-point season, which is an improvement over 46, which is a dramatic improvement over 31. So the Nordiques are gradually getting better to the point where it looks like they'll be back in the playoffs by about 2008. In reality, what they get for Lindros will make it happen a lot quicker than that. It's going to be a sped up process from here. But the Nordiques, there's some optimism. And of course, that optimism, that wonderful nucleus, all these things they're building get realized in Colorado. St. Louis, Brett Hull scores 70. Ho-hum. 80-goal season, 70-goal season. Not too bad. $1.8 million. It's pretty good. Cujo faces a ton of shots. So this is where Curtis Joseph starts to get his reputation as being a world beater of a goaltender who can face 40, 50 shots in a night, and he excels. The thing is, what we find out with Cujo as his career goes along is that's where he excels, is when he faces an absolute ton of shots. When he's on a team that doesn't allow a lot of shots, he has a harder time being focused, and so he struggles when he doesn't face as many shots. He's better off on a team with a lousy defense. San Jose, 17 wins in their first year. As I said, they won more at home than the Whalers. And it is seen as high. The expectations that first year, I remember people were expecting between 10 and 12 wins. San Jose getting 17 seems high, and they would suffer a huge setback in their second year. But that first year, I remember them being very competitive and seeing San Jose gear everywhere. That teal was just everywhere. Everybody wanted a teal jacket and jersey and t-shirts, and San Jose Sharks gear was everywhere. It was very, very popular because blue, red, black were basically your key colors with the NHL. This teal, this is totally different. Yeah, the occasional green with like the Whalers and the Minnesota North Stars, but teal was just different. And so that took off like wildfire. Tampa. Tampa opts for veterans and toughness in the draft. So while Ottawa, we know they're going to be bad, we expect Tampa to be better, and they are. Tampa has a much better roster than we see for the Ottawa Senators, and we know that. And Terry Crisp is the coach, and Roman Hamrlik is their first draft pick. So with Crisp behind the bench, it's pretty good. It's worth noting as well with Ottawa that Mel Bridgman was their general manager, who, let's be honest, was probably not the best guy for the job in retrospect, but hindsight's 2020, right? So the Tampa Bay Lightning under Phil Esposito, Trader Phil, are anticipating being a much better team than Tampa or than Ottawa, and they are. Vancouver, they get first place in their division for the first time since the 70s. And this to me, honestly to me, this was the best team the Vancouver Canucks ever had. This to me was their best roster they ever had put together. And Bure arrives, he's rookie of the year, everything's great, and they win in the first round against Winnipeg, and then the second round against the Oilers, it falls apart. And it was a year that to me felt like this was the best chance. And even looking back now, and I know there was the 2011 team, there's the 1994 team. To me, the 1992 Canucks was the best team they ever had. And what really hurt them between 92 and 93 was Larionov. Larionov left after that year because if the Canucks had re-signed him, there was a payment that had to go back to the Russian Federation, and Larionov said, I don't want them getting any more of that money. They're not getting any more out of me. Larionov was very outspoken about how the conditions were not exactly friendly to players when he was playing for the Soviet Red Army. And so he doesn't want the Canucks to have to pay any money to the Russians. That's why he leaves and ends up going to San Jose. And then, of course, he would end up in Detroit after that. It is a crying shame because Larionov was a huge mentor to Pavel Bure and helped him get acclimated to the North American game. Washington, second overall. Great season, but they lack star power in the big games, and they lose to the Penguins. So they finish really high in the standings and lose to the Penguins in the playoffs. It's a storyline that we've been telling. This is 92. This was 27 years ago. So it's a storyline that's kind of continued. Washington, Pittsburgh is a bad matchup for the Capitals for the most part. I know 2018 changed that narrative, but you still get the feeling that if next spring we see Washington and Pittsburgh in the playoffs against each other, there'd be a number of people that would say, you know what, I'm going to take the Penguins in this because historically, it's usually the Penguins. And if the Penguins are severe underdogs, people are like, oh, the Capitals got 120 points and Pittsburgh got 90. I'm taking Pittsburgh. That's just the way it works. And it goes back to this, and of course in the 80s as well. The Winnipeg Jets. Kind of middle of the pack. 81 points, which is above 500. One game above 500. And they're looking to improve for 2 years in a row. So something they haven't done in their 13 years in the NHL to this point is that if they get better from one season to the next, they have never got better the year after that. So it's always forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. And Jets fans are tired of it. At this stage, it's really frustrating because you get behind the team and then they get better and then they're bad. And then they're better and then they're bad. So this is an instance where they're up and they're trying to avoid going back down in 93. From my memory, and we'll go through this in the next video where we talk about 92-93. They had a pretty good 92-93 season, but again, they're not contenders. They're middle of the pack, and it's a struggle for them. So there you go, 81-point season. Phil Housley played pretty well. Played both on the blue line and on the wing. This was common for Phil Housley at the time, where he'd have some time on the wing as well. Sometimes with offensive defensemen, give them a little bit of time on the wing, and it can help their offensive game. So when you move them back to the blue line, some more of that offense will still be there. And hopefully they're still defensively aware enough that they're not costing you more goals than they get. So there you go. The 91-92 season. Take 7. Bears sleeping. It's all quiet. And we're done. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, thank you guys so much for finally watching, because I finally got it done. I will talk to you again soon.